Hello, and welcome to the very first episode of When All Is Read and Done. I'm Josh.
And I'm Amy, and this is a podcast where we make sense of the world one book at a time.
So, Amy, very exciting. This is our first episode.
I know, a little nerve-wracking as well, if I must say. Since this is our very first episode, I think we can maybe tell the listeners who we are and why we think we're qualified to talk about books. So why don't you kick us off, Josh?
Well, I'm Josh, and I am a women, children, and refugee rights activist, and I'm currently work with UNHCR. The kind of books that I gravitate towards are sci-fi graphic novels and non-fiction. One of my favorite books from last year, one of them was Richard Lloyd Parry's Ghost of the Tsunami, and also Kieran Gillen's The Wicked and the Divine, which I love and which I've tried to recommend to you.
I read it, so don't bash me on that.
Okay.
I just probably didn't like it as much as you did.
Yeah. Okay, but what about you, Amy?
Yeah, so like Josh, I am also Malaysian, although I have been living in the UK for about 4 years now. So my background is in public health, and I currently work in publishing. So I'm not going to spoil my favorite books for last year because that is the book that I've picked for our episode today.
Okay.
And so I have been a lifelong reader, but this year what I really wanted to do was to sort of ruminate on not only the books that I've read, but spend a little more time understanding the structures and the ecosystems around these books. So this is one of the main motivations for me anyway, to start this podcast. We say our podcast is to make sense of the world one book at a time. You know, the world is super complicated. There's just so much to take apart. And I think books are a great way to understand and unpack the discourses around, you know, what we care about. So gender, race, history, class, human rights, you know, and so on. So let's segue into our first episode then. So we are going to be talking about representation, and especially in fiction, in books, and why this is important to us.
Yeah. So why is representation important, Amy?
I feel like I'm in a pub quiz. So Amy, tell me
Yeah, for 25 marks, can you tell us why is representation in fiction important?
Yeah, so for me, I think representation in fiction, especially books, for us readers, they're important for two main reasons. So inclusion and perception. So, you know, inclusion is like, you know, reading about someone who sounds like you and experiences life in a similar way can make you feel included in society. So I think you might have some great examples, Josh. But for me, you know, like the very first time I experienced this was reading, you know, Amy Tan and Adeline Yenma as a teenager. And I just felt, you know, for the first time ever, I felt seen in pop culture and literature. And it's not like these characters and I have anything similar apart from, you know, the names. Our names sound Asian. They sound, you know, relatable to me. And what about you? How do you think books and characters in fiction make you feel included?
For me, when I was thinking about this topic, and I was thinking about when I was growing up, right? You know, I love Swamp Thing, Spider-Man, Batman, and Lord of the Rings, Never-Ending Story. They never had characters in them that looked like me, right? And so the fantasies of my childhood or in those formative years were not filled with characters that mirrored me in any sort of deep or meaningful way. And I think it's important to point out here, right, that it doesn't mean that you cannot love characters who are totally unlike you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? But I think what that does, when I populated these fantasy worlds in my mind, they never had people that were like me in there, right? So I could dream of like dragons and hobbits or mutants and shapeshifters and all those things. But like a Chinese person, front and center in these stories, that just really felt like, oh, that's a bridge too far. Right?
Yeah, I kind of know what you mean. You know, like growing up, I didn't read a lot of fantasy, so I read a lot of like high school romances and rom-com, you know, things like that. But it always centers around, you know, like a white character from the US or from the UK. And you kind of have the impression like, you know, cool things only happen abroad. They never happen back home. And you never see yourself in these situations. And you feel like, in a sense, it feels like, oh, maybe I don't deserve high school romance, or I don't deserve adventures because I don't look this way, I don't sound this way, and I didn't grow up, in these environments.
Yeah, and to take that a step further, right? I mentioned The Weaker and the Divine. The Kieran Gillen who wrote that, he said, fantasies are a test bed for thinking about who you are. Well, I think that it can be extended to all fiction, really, right? Or the fiction that we are drawn to. That when we read, it can be a test bed for us to hold up this mirror, for us to interact with it, for us to engage with issues that we might otherwise feel is beyond our grasp, or maybe that we don't have the language to interact with. But if I cannot relate to the stuff that I'm reading on that level,
Yep.
then what happens, right?
Yep.
What happens when we are locked out of these stories that we gravitate towards? I think when we were coming out of this episode, what we wanted to do was pick some books that for us helped us to be able to maybe see ourselves being represented in fiction, or maybe is a path forward towards inclusivity in fiction. And the book that I picked was Monstress by Marjorie Liu and Sana Takeda. Now, I don't know whether you have read Monstress before, have you?
So unfortunately not, but when you mentioned that you were going to pick up this book, I, went online and had a look at, some of the characters represented in this book, and I found it very, very interesting. So they are centered around a matriarchal society, and it's like a fantasy novel, a fantasy graphic novel. So could you tell us a little bit more about, what this book is, how the characters are, and how it influenced you?
Honestly, that when I picked it up, right, I wasn't doing it because it's set in the early 20th century Asia, or because it's filled with Asian characters or filled with female characters. All I was looking for really was a fantasy graphic novel, and this was one that had won numerous awards. Like, it had won 3 Hugo Awards, 2 British Fantasy Awards, right? So that was the first thing that drew me to it. Right? And then I picked it up and I was like, oh my God, like this is like so epic. And so basically, the world of Monstress, it's a world that is populated by 3 main races. You have the humans, you have your ancients, which are basically immortal, sentient animals. And then you have the arcanics, which are half human, half ancient. And these arcanics are hunted and they are enslaved by the Cumia, which are like human witches. Protagonist of Monstress is Micah Half-Wolf, who is an arcanic who begins Monstress enslaved and imprisoned. And she discovers that she carries inside her a monster. So that's why they call it Monstress, right? And so I think the first thing, when we talk about Monstress, you have to talk about the artwork. Right? And you have seen it. You have seen some of the images for Monstress.
Yes, it's absolutely breathtaking. It's so beautiful.
Yeah, it's really, really stunning.
Because when you describe it like half human, half animal, I'm imagining BoJack Horseman. But then when I looked at
this is like the furthest thing.
But then when I looked at the pictures of the illustrations of the novel, it's not at all like BoJack Horseman. It's very sophisticated. It's very breathtaking.
Yeah. So for any BoJack Horseman's fans out there,
they might be disappointed.
Yeah, you might. But for everybody else, the artwork is absolutely stunning, right? So Sana Takeda, she's a Japanese artist, and she feels this whole world is this really distinctly Asian gods, monsters, people. There's a ton of steampunk. One thing I will say though, that if you're looking to pick it up, it is extremely violent, right? So not for kids, and there is some nudity, but without any of the fetishizing either of the nudity or the violence.
That's very important, I feel.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially in fantasy. When you think about fantasy, obviously it's a bit different now. Fantasy is a lot more diverse. But for the longest time, these huge epic fantasy that you are describing, right? They're historically dominated by, white male authors. A lot of them are no longer even alive, but then authors today are competing for shelf space with these male white authors. And they're taking up so much space, in pop culture, in bookstores, in, fantasy conversations.
I think the biggest thing is going to be that these authors are the ones that are going to be setting the tone for that particular genre, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what you're going to have is repetition of these narrative themes, right? Good versus evil, man versus himself, the epic journey.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
you know, I think what I love about writers like Marjorie Liu
Mm-hmm.
is that they are pushing the boundaries of what themes can be explored. Like, so Marjorie Liu says about writing Monstress, right? When I was growing up, there was no conversation about race. So this absence of conversation came out in my work. When I wrote Monstress, it was a reaction to this silence, my own silence, the silence I grew up with. It is a fantasy graphic novel about slavery, racism, colonialism,
Mm.
about being a woman, and it's contributed to anything. It's hopefully to show the absence of these things around it. And
That's very powerful.
yeah, it is. And I am just
Mm.
so glad that we have writers like Marjorie Liu who's
Yep.
speaking into that void, like this absence that, as she says,
Yep.
and is using this grand epic setting
Yeah.
to really, discuss things like racism, slavery,
Mm-hmm.
the dehumanizing aspects of war, and I think maybe most pertinent for the times that we're living in right now, the
Mm.
commodification of mixed race bodies, right?
Yep.
And so she uses the archanics, the half human, half ancients, as a metaphor for ethnic minorities in society and how, as a society, we are glad to capitalize on these people,
Mm-hmm.
but who are not human enough to be guaranteed, dignity and
Mm.
respect, right? And I think we can see a lot of parallels, with the
Yep.
violence that's been inflicted upon Asian people right now.
Yep.
Um, and how people are using, anti-COVID-19 sentiment as an excuse for racial
Mm-hmm.
violence. Closer to home, how migrants, whose bodies countries like Malaysia gladly, exploits economically,
Yep.
but were the first to be targeted and locked up once COVID-19 hit here, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think it really is important that when we look into fantasy or really the fiction that we read, right?
Mm-hmm.
Fiction is a way to hold up that mirror for us to be able to
Mm.
have that difficult conversations, right? The conversations that we are not having with others around us, with ourselves, or maybe just to find the kind of language to be able to put into words how we feel about these issues.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely, absolutely. So I think like, after this week, so we're in the third week of March. So last week that was the Atlanta shooting that
yeah,
targeted Asian Americans, and obviously in our community, the readers community, the first instinct is to let's come up with a list of diverse authors. But for me, as an Asian female living in the UK, I felt
mm,
like all these sentiments were a little bit lost on me. It felt a little bit empty. I'm not sure how reading the Joy Luck Club is going to protect me from an attack unless I hurl a hardback copy of the Joy Luck Club at the attacker. You know what I'm saying? But at the same time, I do understand this reaction from the readers community. I do understand that they feel a little helpless, and this is the first step that they can take, the first step that maybe they can let their allies know how they can empathize with them, and how you can, you know, uh, you relate to people who are, currently feeling a little lost. So I do think that books are important. However, it's probably not the only action that we can take, but it does help to amplify voices that are, historically or even contemporarily lost in the discourse today. Okay, so yeah, Josh, I think you've mentioned that, representation in fiction is such an important mirror in how you see yourself and how you see the way society sees you. But for me, I think representation, aside from being a mirror, is also an important window out into the world where, you can challenge your preconceived perception and stereotypes about uh, people around you who may not look like you, who may appear worlds away or very different from you, your understanding and your culture. And I think
mhm.
representation in fiction is also important to challenge this. So it's not only a mirror, it's also a window.
Yeah. And I'm not going to spoil your pick, and I'm going to let you introduce it.
You can spoil
But
it.
no, but the book that you're going to be talking about, I think it's just so interesting because when you talk about a window looking into someone else's experience, right? The reception that this book has received over the past year, it might have been amplified a little bit because of Black Lives Matter, maybe.
Mhm.
But at the same time, like from the reviews that I've read, and even looking at your reviews on your Instagram account, I read and drink tea.
Oh,
For
thanks
anyone who
for the
wants to follow
plug.
Amy.
You're really building up the suspense to this book now.
Yeah, it's just the how intersectional, even
Yep.
within that one community that you're looking at, right?
Yep.
How intersectional those lives are. So, okay, enough of all the build up. What is the book that you are going to be talking about?
Yeah, so I think for anyone who knows me or follows my Instagram, this is no surprise. So this is also my first pick for the first ever book club meeting that we had. So this is Bernardine Evaristo's Girl, Woman, Other. This was my favorite book of 2020. I actually read this twice, and
Oh wow.
each time I didn't want it to end. So we talked about our childhood a little bit in the beginning of the episode. So like many Malaysian children, I grew up reading about British boarding schools or like fictional worlds of Enid Blyton or Roald Dahl, and I'm sure like that's probably your reading trajectory as well as a kid. And
Yeah.
yeah, so like in my formative years, for example, so I fell in love with writers like Ian McKellen, Julian Barnes, and Martin Amis. So I was really excited. So maybe a lot of people don't know, but we actually, although we're both Malaysians, we met in London because we were part of the same scholarship program. So when I
Mhm.
first arrived in London, I had quite a skewed perception of the city, of this place, its people, and its problems. So I think Girl, Woman, Other is just such a wonderful representation of not only contemporary but also historical England, from voices that have always been hidden. So just very briefly, Girl, Woman, Other is a novel about 12 girls, women, and also a trans man. And each one of their stories is standalone, but they're also intertwining with one another's. And each one of these 12 characters is so well thought out. It's so believable. You feel like you're watching a play, right in front of you as you're reading this book. And you wouldn't think that, a Black middle-aged lesbian playwright would have anything in common with a white conservative retired school teacher. But,
Mhm.
somehow Evaristo just succeeds in beautifully tying up these 12 characters. So it's extremely impressive. And I really am pushing this book into like everyone's hands because yeah, and I think you mentioned briefly, but this book won the Man Booker Prize in 2019. So
Yeah.
unfortunately, it was a joint
Yeah.
winner. So it was tied with Margaret
Margaret
Atwood.
Atwood, right?
So
Yeah.
for people like me, we're like, really riled up about this because we think Evaristo should have deserved her own Booker Prize.
Uh-huh.
But I think what you said earlier was quite true. A lot of people have been discussing that whether a book like Girl, Woman, Other could have, won the Booker Prize if it's not because of the climate in which we're living in right now.
I don't think it's a knock against Evaristo or Goldman Other that it won in a year that we had all the conversation around Black Lives Matter, all the conversation around race. It is this confirmation that there's this groundswell of support
Mm-hmm.
around mainstreaming uh, conversations around race, and that these kind of conversations can take so many different forms, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have Rennie Edward Lodge coming out with why I'm no longer talking to white people about race, and you have
Mm-hmm.
all these different non-fiction authors that speak
Yep.
to race to different extents from different perspectives, and then
Mm-hmm.
you have literature as well, right? With
Yep.
like Evaristo and Goldman Other, which comes in from a totally different perspective,
Yep.
which gives you a form of connection and empathy with the characters that she portrays on the page.
Mm-hmm.
I think one question that I have was really, so you said that there is 12 characters, right?
Yeah.
Did you feel that enough time was given to all the different characters, or was there maybe like one that you felt, oh, I wish that I could have heard more from? Uh, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, like I said earlier, this was a book that I really didn't want to end. She could write a standalone book about each character and then have like this epic series of 12 books, and I would I would be the first one in line to get on board with that. So I think what she does really well is, when we think about representation, I think very commonly we think about gender, we think about race, and we think about sexuality. And she does cover all of this very well in this book. But she also forces us to think about, the intersectionality of these issues and how this
Mhm.
can impact somebody's lived experiences. And I just love the spectrum of these 12 characters. And I think maybe putting them all in one book that's 350 pages or so, it makes it accessible. So if you were a very casual reader and you don't give too much thought about social justice or intersectionality, and you just want to pick up one book for its entertainment value, this could be that as well, on top of addressing all these issues. So I think
Mhm.
what I found the most interesting was some of these older characters as well. So when we think about representation, sometimes we don't think about age.
Yeah.
The discourse of body type and age, it
Mhm.
doesn't really have the same spotlight as gender and race and sexuality. But
Mm.
she does cover this, and that's why there are 12 characters, because each one of them have these different intersections of these different inequalities and their insecurities, but it's also a source of their strengths as well. So we
Mm.
know that this is definitely real life, because each one of us, we have different insecurities, different strengths. And I think she does this really, really well in this book, and this is something that is very rarely highlighted in fiction.
Yeah. I just want to come back to the point that you said about accessibility, right? Because yes, I have seen tons of people picking this up, reading it and loving it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering for the casual reader, right? And one of the things that
Mm.
I've read about the book is that, it's written without a single full stop. There are no quote marks. For you, right?
I actually
Like,
didn't even notice that,
yeah,
like,
but it
but but
sounds,
but some people have mentioned that, oh, it's super hard to read because of this what would you call this,
so
artistic
yeah,
expression? Yeah.
it looks more, or it might read more like poetry, right? Like it's a
Yes.
mixture of poetry and prose together on the page, right? And so I know for you that you didn't feel like that was a something that you had to overcome. Like you barely notice it.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, but do you think that for the casual reader that this would be like when we're introducing a book that maybe has this
Mm-hmm.
steeper difficulty curve,
Mm-hmm.
um, getting to it as opposed to maybe one that is more conventionally written, and then on top of that, like one of the selling points is, oh, it's intersectional,
Yeah.
right? And if that's something they're exploring for the first time,
Mm-hmm.
do you, do you maybe think that there's a hurdle that's too far?
Yeah, I certainly don't think so, because we live in modern times. There are many ways to consume a book.
Mhm.
So I didn't mention this, but the first time I read Girl, Woman, Other, I listened to the audiobook. And that is
Right.
why, like the issue of punctuations, the issue of there not being, the capitalized first letter of every word, like it really didn't matter to me, because I listened to it in an audiobook form. And I think the interesting about Evaristo is also, like, she's quite a famous playwright as well,
Mhm.
on top of being an author. So she puts a lot of care into her writing, so that they come across sort of like a performance, I think.
Mhm.
And yeah, so if there's a casual reader who think that, oh, I do really want to step into this intersectional space, however, I am intimidated by poetry, I don't really understand this form, then maybe pick up the audiobook. It was
Yeah.
fantastic. It was literally like watching a play in my head while I was listening to the audiobook, and like getting on with my commute or my chores. So
Hmm.
that would be my recommendation, actually.
Yeah. I've never picked up an audiobook before,
Shame on
but
you.
if I were, hey,
But
but if
this
I
is this is a good
were,
one. Yeah.
I would, yeah, I would pick this one up, just because there's been just so much positive, reactions to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I've told you before, I don't read fiction novels right
Mm-hmm.
now,
Mm-hmm.
but maybe this could be a loophole that I can exploit.
We're not doing episode 2 if you don't read Girl, Woman, Other. That's what I'm saying.
Oh no. Okay, so yeah, do you have any other recommendations for if people want to expand, or look into representation in fiction? Any other books that you think would be like really accessible for maybe casual readers, or even for people who are, serious readers but maybe haven't thought deeply about representation?
We are Malaysians, and I feel like this very strong tie to Malaysian literature as well. So we cannot, let the episode end without me making at least a couple of Malaysian recommendations. So I would really recommend We the Survivors by Tash Aw, and also Evening is the Whole Day by Preeta Samarasan. So, I think diversity in Malaysia definitely looks very different from what we usually read about in the US, in the UK. So in Malaysia, it's not just about race. There's so much, other layers to unpack as well in terms of, social economic circumstances and so on, and also interlaced with race. So I would definitely recommend these two by these Malaysian authors.
You brought up a really good point about how, when we talk about representation, that we should also look at representation within the context that we are in, because a lot of the times we can actually, when we talk about representation, really what we mean is a Western perspective on representation, right? And I think that is something that for me is something that I'm still working on, because when I think about representation, honestly, the first thing I reach for is really from a Western-centric perspective, right? I wouldn't interrogate it so much from what is the Malaysian idea of representation, and it's really trying to sometimes superimpose what you have read from these Western authors into our own society, and that can sometimes be a source of frustration, because then if it doesn't gel neatly, and then you feel like why is this happening here, or why is the literature that I'm diving into like not connecting with the real world that I'm living in. So I think it is important to do that, and it's something that for myself, an area that I can improve in as well. Fiction is not going to save the world, right? But and we can't hang our hopes on diversity or inclusion on the works of fiction, no matter how brilliant they are, right? No matter how brilliant these authors are.
Yes.
But creating that space, right? Giving voice to minorities or those whose voices have either been suppressed or just ignored for a long time. Introducing diversity, not just for diversity's sake, but to reflect the world that we live in. I think that is a great place to start.
Yes, absolutely. And what a lovely sentiment to end the episode with. So if you've enjoyed this episode, do follow us on Instagram at Read and Done. And you can also contact us at readanddonepod@gmail.com.
Yeah, and do join us for our next episode, where we are going to be talking about diversity, but in the authors that we are reading. And so I'm really looking forward to the conversation with you, Amy. I think even from this first episode, it's quite apparent that we don't read the same stuff.
But I hope that is our strength, and not our downfall.
Yeah, we will find out. And you can find out too when you tune in the next episode.
Until next time.
Bye.